All right. So if you're paying really close to Mr. Betts, and why wouldn't you be? You had a foreshadowing of the entire lecture today, but the main point that he makes, and it's a smart point, the point I was trying to make at the end of last week's class, is the Compromise of 1850, the thing that was supposed to settle the sectional issues, is actually the thing that makes the divisions worse. In many ways, the trauma of the 1850s comes about as a result of some of the, at least two of the four provisions of the Compromise of 1850. So we have to go through this train wreck that is the 1850s. We did our little visual demonstration of that at the end of class on Tuesday. Now we need to kind of look at the traumas that the country goes through during this period. Understand, I might go through some of it pretty quickly. This is all textbook stuff. This is all stuff you can get details from Maclay. What I offer different from Maclay is probably a little bit different interpretations. Okay, so let's get into the first trauma. Coming directly from the Compromise of 1850. The part of the Compromise of 1850 that nobody thought would be that big a deal was a stronger national slave law, a stronger fugitive slave law. Slaves who run away. This is a law that addresses runaway slaves, or how you deal with runaway slaves. There had been a fugitive slave law in the United States since 1790s. This 1851 kind of updates it. I don't think anyone thought that this was going to be that big a deal for the fact that most slaves don't run away. I think estimates are only about 5% of enslaved persons ever tried to run away. When they tried to run away, it was usually Kentucky, Tennessee. If you're in the deep South or someplace like Texas, you're just generally not trying to run away, just for the absolute impossibility or utter difficulty of trying to do it. Most slaves didn't run away. And so nobody thought this would be that big of a deal. Certainly they couldn't expect the absolute sectional chaos that results from this new law. Okay, so the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 is announced. Understand what had been going on before then. So we have a fugitive slave law in the books since the 1790s. Several northern states decided they didn't want to follow it. So in the 1830s and the 1840s, several northern states began passing what were called personal liberty laws. These personal liberty laws were, well, what it sounds like. If you're a runaway slave and you make it to our state, you're free. Our law enforcement is not going to help round you up. Right? The Fugitive Slave Law, this is a federal law. Federal Fugitive Slave Law of 1790 says law enforcement has to help capture runaway slaves. These personal liberty laws say, no, we don't. They're in many ways a direct violation of federal law. But we do this kind of thing all the time throughout our history. States don't like laws, and so they pass stuff that maybe contradicts, in some cases outright contradicts. We have that now, right? Is marijuana illegal in the United States? Federally, yes. Is marijuana illegal in Michigan? No, it's not. How is that? How could marijuana be illegal in the United States, but legal in Michigan, or legal in Colorado, or legal in California? This is federalism. And so this is going on during this time. Several northern states wanted to be done with the slavery business altogether, right? A northern state that can, outlaw slavery, but still has to capture runaway slaves, is a state that's still involved in slavery.
So northern states that, we don't want to be a part of this. They pass these personal liberty laws. Our law enforcement are not going to be responsible for capturing runaway slaves. If you are a slave, you make it to our state, you're free. We're not going to apprehend you. Southerners saw these personal liberty laws as probably what they were, violations of federal law, violations of federal authority. And after the nullification crisis, Southern states are like, this is state inequality, right? This is not fair. You complained about Southern states not wanting to follow federal law, not wanting to follow the Tariff of Abomination. Now you're allowing these Northern states to pass these personal liberty laws. So Southerners, particularly Southern slave owners, were desperate for a stronger fugitive slave law as a part of the Compromise of 1850. They get that. The new federal law of 1850 essentially nullified the personal liberty laws in this way. If a slave runs away to your state, you don't help capture them. You can be financially or even criminally responsible. You can be fined up to $1,000. You can even spend time in jail for not helping capture a runaway slave. Conversely, if you do help capture a runaway slave, whether you're a law enforcement or just an ordinary citizen, you do help apprehend one of these runaway slaves. You're going to pay $10. You can get paid. Americans now can get paid for helping to capture runaway slaves. Do you see some potential problems with this new law? Paying people to capture runaway slaves? But how could this go wrong? How could this go badly? What's that?
That person's a slave, or was a slave.
Look at the wording up there. There were 500,000. I mean, there were really hundreds of thousands of free persons of color in northern states at this time. What's to prevent a slave catcher from coming to a free person of color and saying, "Hey, I think you're that runaway slave. I need to get paid." Person free all their life suddenly finds themselves enslaved. Did this happen that often? No. Happened sometimes. But the potential under this law, particularly with the financial incentive, is that it's going to happen a lot more. So there's that aspect of it, is what will happen to our free populations, populations of African Americans in the North under this. But more generally, what upset Northerners was the feeling that their states' rights were being violated. Right? The states' rights complaint is not just exclusive to Southerners. In this case, it's Northerners. They felt the slave power of the South, this oligarchy of slave owners, are using the federal government to bring the North back into the business of slavery through slave catching. If you're going to force free states to be involved in capturing runaway slaves, then essentially slavery is not banned even in the North. Essentially, slavery is a national institution through slave catching, and extended slave catching now under the 1850 law. So Northerners absolutely freaked out. The effect of the Fugitive Slave Act is to really to expand the anti-slavery movement in the North, to bring in people who really weren't that interested in it or really had no interest. And it's not so much that Northerners suddenly in mass start arguing that slavery should end in the South, as much as the morality of slavery becomes the immorality of slavery, should I say, becomes even a greater message being communicated from the north towards the south. This is for all of the political conflicts of this decade, this is a time of intense culture war, with Northerners increasingly after the Fugitive Slave Act complaining about the immorality of Southern slavery. Conversely, Southerners beginning to advance a pro-slavery argument. I used to give a whole lecture that included part of it was on the pro-slavery argument. I don't do that anymore, but this is what's going on during this decade, and it's a reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act. The debate over the morality of slavery intensifies dramatically. Northern states engage in civil disobedience to a degree that they never had before. Yes, there was an underground railroad before 1850. The Underground Railroad helping African Americans get from the South into northern states, get into places like Detroit, honestly, cross the Detroit River into Canada, secure their freedom. There was an Underground Railroad before 1850, but nothing like after 1850, right? The effect of the Fugitive Slave Act and Northern reaction to it was to expand the Underground Railroad. So civil disobedience dramatically increases. You get one of the most influential books in American history. Certainly Tom Paine's Common Sense was influential, possibly more consequential than Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. But the truth is that Stowe's novel, a fictional novel, but based upon slave accounts and slave experiences and things, dramatically increases debates over the morality of slavery among Northerners. Northerners, there's not a fight that most Northerners really wanted to have. The Fugitive Slave Act and reading Uncle Tom's Cabin dramatically increases anti-slavery sentiment among Northerners. And I mean, Stowe herself. Yeah, I mean, she was anti-slavery before she wrote this novel, but not something that she was really ever going to take any action on until the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. She was inspired to write her novel because of this so-called bloodhound law, as it was known in the North. It was this open season on persons of color in the North. The Southerners and slave catchers are coming in and using the federal government to force Northerners back into the business of perpetuating slavery in this country. Stowe herself wrote this novel as a reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act. You had politicians like Charles Sumner arguing from Washington. I mean, here's a person whose job is supposed to uphold federal law, right? He's part of the federal government, he's a U.S. Senator. He is giving speeches in which he's saying, look, yes, the Fugitive Slave Act is the law of the land, but there's a higher law. This is his term, a higher law. And this becomes part of the civil disobedience rhetoric of the North. We must obey a higher law. There's a higher law, and the higher law respects the dignity, the innate, the right to liberty of all persons, regardless of color. And so we are charged with obeying the higher law. In this case, not federal law. So, I mean, you had civil disobedience expanding dramatically in the North in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, and you had Northern politicians actively encouraging this civil disobedience. As you might imagine, this set up for conflict. In 1851, a town in Pennsylvania, a runaway slave was tracked there to this town. This town decided to come out in defense of this slave against the slave catchers in that town, and an outright gunfight broke out in this town. The newspapers reported it this way the next day. Civil war. The first blow struck. Before there was the official Civil War of 1861, Americans were already at civil war 10 years before that. in, in this case, in a town in Pennsylvania, Americans are already coming to blows, or coming to conflict over the issue of slavery, particularly, and really the expansion of slavery. Although the Fugitive Slave Act is really kind of bridging debates over the expansion of slavery, but also the morality of slavery as well, too. Both of those things are contained in the Fugitive Slave Act. This isn't resolved, right? We have looked at several crises the United States have gone through that have ended in compromise, and the Union has continued on. There is no compromise at the end of the fugitive slave law, right? There's crisis, and the crisis never really goes away. There's no resolution. What there is the next crisis. So Americans are still trying to, they're still reeling from the effects of the response to the Fugitive Slave Act, when they take up something else to fight about. And this is directly about the expansion of slavery, the fight over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this goes back to the Compromise of 1850 as well, too, right? As I said, the Fugitive Slave Act was part of the Compromise of 1850, made things worse. One of the other parts of the Compromise of 1850 was this idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, part of the Compromise of 1850, actually will make things worse. You're paying attention to Mr. Betts, you saw him make that claim. The idea of popular sovereignty proposed by a northern politician, Stephen Douglas, in the 1850s. Douglas was the head of the head of the Democratic Party. Douglas in 1850 says, look, rather than the federal government telling any future state out in the Southwest whether they should be slave or whether they should be free, let's let the people themselves decide, right? That's democracy. Let's let the people themselves in the future decide. Popular sovereignty. The people are sovereign over their territory. But nobody's in the Southwest to really organize it into states. Where they are is in present-day Kansas and Nebraska. Those are the first states that are looking to commit to the Union here in 1854. They need to be brought into the Union because we got this whole transcontinental railroad we're trying to build, and we kind of would like to build it through like U.S. states. So we need states there to be able to run the railroad through. And so Kansas, Nebraska are going to be organized. Douglas says, let's try popular sovereignty. We have this idea we talked about in the Compromise of 1850. Let's use it here, right? We're going to add 2 new states. Every time we're adding states, we know this, Americans get into a fight. Slave or free. You want to make a new state, Kansas? You want to make a new state, Nebraska? Should it be slave or going to be free? Forget any kind of 36-30 line or anything like that. Douglas said, let's let the people themselves decide. That seems to be a democratic solution for a democratic society, right? Let's let the people of Kansas and Nebraska themselves decide. You see any potential problems with popular sovereignty? You see any potential problems with this idea? Let's let the people of Kansas and Nebraska decide whether they have slavery or not. Who are the people of Kansas and Nebraska? They aren't states. So what exactly constitutes a Kansas or a Nebraska in the absence of a state? How can Kansas and Nebraskans decide whether slavery or not when there are no Kansans or Nebraskans? Look, democracy works because we've established all kinds of ground rules. And you go vote in the 2020 election. Did you go vote in the morning and then like come back in the afternoon and vote again. A few people tried. No one in this room. A few people tried in 2020. One guy killed his wife and then voted for Donald Trump in her name. I'm not making that up. That actually happened. We don't do that. We don't go and vote twice. We vote once because one person, one vote. Why one person, one vote? Did God say one person, one vote? No. We decided on some ground rules. All right, before we have a voting system, let's set some ground rules. One person, one vote. Who votes in US elections? Citizens of the United States. You're not a citizen, you shouldn't be voting in our elections, right? Did God say? No, we just decided on some basic ground rules. I mean, imagine trying to play an NFL game when you haven't decided what is and it is not a catch, what is and is not in bounds, right? Sports work because there's people outside of the game who say, this is what a catch is, this is what out of bounds, this is what offsides are. They set the rules. That is what allows a game to proceed. This is what allows democracy to work. Problem with Kansas and Nebraska, it sounds good in theory, let the people themselves decide, but somebody had to be the outsider establishing the rules. And one of the most important rules that needed to be established that nobody established. Who's going to vote? Who's going to vote? Specifically, Kansas is going to come in first. Who's going to vote in Kansas? That's not really established. So, in the absence of those kinds of rules, both the North and the South decided to kind of, well, win for their side. So in New England states developed it's called the New England Aid Society. All right. So we want to make sure that Kansas comes in as a free state. So New Englanders started raising all this money to send young sons and daughters out to Kansas to make sure that Kansas would be a free state. Is that fair? Were those New England sons and daughters residents of Kansas? Missourians get wind of what New England is doing. I said, well, that's not right. Missourians, they start crossing into Kansas. They're crossing into Kansas. They're planning to just go in and vote as a Kansas and then go back to Missouri the next night. Right? I mean, it's just, it is a mess what's going on in Kansas. And so should we be surprised that the election chaos in Kansas as a result of nobody establishing the ground rules for the election results in further bloodshed? Right? We've already had civil war in little towns as early as 1851. Now in 1855, we enter into the period known as Bleeding Kansas. As Kansans, whatever that means, as Kansans literally come into conflict and bloodshed with each other. So a group of Missourians have become known among Northerners as the border ruffians. This is all McClay textbook stuff, by the way. These Missourians go to Lawrence, a free state stronghold. They burn the place. They drive the people out. The sack of Lawrence is becoming. So Missourians are not just trying to mess with the elections. They are literally coming to bloodshed and conflict and violence in 1855. Well, one Yankee isn't going to stand for it. His name is John Brown. John Brown, who perfectly normal, hears voices from God who tell him that he should go free the slaves. Where should I start, Lord? About Kansas. John Brown and his sons go out to Kansas.
They find a group of these Missourians at a place called Potawatomi, cut them up with broadswords. Didn't even take the time to use rifles. Cut them up with broadswords. The Potawatomi Massacre. John Brown, one of the members of the RAP, the Radical Abolition Party. Got to obey that higher law. Got to do what God tells me to do. In this case, going out and killing people in Kansas. And so the compromise of 1850, which is supposed to heal the nation's divisions, literally ends up in bloodshed. First in the fugitive slave, in fights with the Fugitive Slave Act, now in fights over, as a result of this idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty ends in the bloodshed of bleeding Kansas. Does that mean that democracy doesn't work? No. I think what the bleeding Kansas shows us is democracy works as long as we've established some ground rules for competition, right? There have to be referees, there have to be umpires, there have to be people outside of the game establishing the rules. The teams themselves cannot or should not get to make the rules. One of the problems we're having in the United States right now is that the teams get to make the rules for the elections. That's really weird. The last time that happened, or for a lot of our history, it's worked out okay. But in the 1850s, the teams trying to make the rules for the elections ended in the Civil War. So not great. Democracy works well when teams, in this case Republicans and Democrats, decide to play by agreed upon set of rules. When we stop agreeing on what the rules should be for elections, we are heading for more political violence, which unfortunately is probably going to characterize the 2020s. Not civil war, but increased political violence. I really, honestly, I think it's only good. And it's a major consequence of letting the teams try to, make the rules, right? I mean, imagine U of M at the end of the fourth quarter of the U of M MSU game, U of M going to the refs and saying, hey, I think if we could play another quarter, if we could play a fifth quarter, we might be able to take those guys. Could you give us a fifth quarter? Or, maybe give us 5 downs. We didn't quite do it on 4, but if you give us 1 more down, maybe we can work it. Nobody would stand for that. Well, this is kind of the world that we're living in. With one party or the other asking for a fifth quarter or asking for a fifth down. And it's not going to end well. In 1854, it ended in bleeding Kansas. A number of significances from the Kansas-Nebraska Act and bleeding Kansas. One, it's a reminder that the expansion of slavery, right? The morality of slavery by the 1850s is bringing Americans into conflict. But the expansion of slavery, in this case, into states like Kansas, Nebraska, is really expanding, is really bringing on civil war at a much more regional kind of scale. So it's the expansion of slavery that is probably the greatest trigger for bringing on civil war within the United States. It's significant for fostering conflict back home, right? The expansion of slavery leads to bleeding Kansas, so conflict out present-day Midwest. But the conflict was coming back home too. One of the traumatic events in Washington as a result of the fight over Kansas, was the caning of Charles Sumner. Remember, I just talked about Charles Sumner, one of these anti-slavery voices. In response to Bleeding Kansas and the violence against Free Staters, Sumner gave this speech in the congressional floor in which a number of people would say he went a little too far. He hinted that the reason that Southerners wanted to expand slavery is because they wanted to have more sex with their female slaves. You weren't supposed to talk about this, right? I mean, the rape of female slaves was systematic, particularly on the larger plantations in the South, but you weren't supposed to talk about that. That wasn't supposed to be going on, right? These were fine Southern Christian gentlemen. These are honorable men. They don't rape their slaves, but they did so all the time. You weren't supposed to talk about it. Sumner had to talk about it. One person who was pretty offended was Southerner Preston Brooks. So the next day, Congress is adjourned, but Sumner is in the chamber, sitting at his desk, doing some paperwork and stuff. Preston Brooks comes up behind him with his cane. We're beating the hell out of him. Now, this is not unusual for Congress during these years. There's a piece of land outside. No, I'm serious. There's a piece of land outside of Washington, D.C. that was known as the Congressional Dueling Grounds. Dueling was still practiced. It was growing out of popularity, but it was still practiced in Washington, D.C. So like two guys would have it out in the congressional floor, and then they grab their guns and they go out to the Congressional Dueling Grounds and they shoot each other. You might think to yourself, man, but wouldn't it be nice if, I think that we probably need more congresspersons getting shot today. Maybe that would solve some of our problems if some of these guys were shooting each other a little bit more. In this case, Preston Brooks doesn't even invite Sumner to go out. He just sneaks up behind him and literally beats the hell out of Sumner with his cane. To which Southerners respond by sending Preston Brooks a bunch of new canes. So the violence of Kansas works its way all the way back into the halls of Washington, D.C. You know, I said Americans can be as divided, can be divided to an incredible extent. Americans are, continuing to divide at a popular level, at a cultural level during these years. One thing I didn't mention, the denominational splits of the 1840s. Why? Well, there aren't anymore. You're familiar with United Methodists. United against what? Well, it's because for a long time there were Northern and Southern Methodists. Why were there Northern and Southern Methodists? Because in the 1840s they divided over slavery. There are still Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists today. Where did Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists come from? Because in 1844, Baptists split over slavery. Right? So the American people continue to divide. Christianity's no help. Christians are the ones leading these divisions in some ways. But as long as our politicians can get together, when our politicians start beating each other with canes, it's really hard to imagine the country holding together at that point. Final significance of the Kansas-Nebraska is that it is the launch pad for a new sectional political party. This kind of brings us back to a topic that I was talking about on Tuesday, the Republican Party. Remember the Free Soilers that I talked about? Free Soilers closed their door in 1854, but a new party emerges in 1854, the Republican Party. The Republican Party emerges in 1854, and it's all about opposition to the expansion of slavery. It's all about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Not only does Kansas launch the Republican Party, but it relaunches the career. Person you might have heard, you heard of Abraham Lincoln before? No? It's a new name for some of you. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln. An Illinois politician.
He had been, Lincoln had been a senator from Illinois back in the 1830s, but he was only a one-termer. He was a Whig. He was a one-termer and went back to practicing law after he lost his reelection bid. In response to Kansas, Nebraska, Lincoln comes out of retirement to lead the Republican Party and to lead the opposition against slavery. You heard Mr. Betts talk about House divided, it's against itself, can't stand, and blah, blah, blah. That's all Lincoln. That's all Lincoln in 1854, giving his Peoria speech. And you read that speech, it's all about Kansas, Nebraska. And he points out some of the things that I've pointed out, right? He talks about the problem with the Kansas, Nebraska Act is nobody has established the ground rules for how we even conduct an election in this area. So you can't let the people decide when you haven't even told the people, here are the rules, right? The federal government at least has to provide the rules for the election. In the absence of that, Lincoln in 1854 predicts this is going to end in bloodshed. And of course, it does end in bloodshed. So there's a number of significances for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You know, producing outright civil war out west, bringing that conflict back home, launching this new sectional political party, the Republican Party, and relaunching the career of Abraham Lincoln. What is the what's the compromise on Kansas, Nebraska? There is none. There's no resolution to this. Now, eventually, Kansas comes into the Union in 1861 as a free state. A little late by then. What else is going on in 1861? The South has already left the Union. They've attacked Fort Sumter. The Union's raising its army. There's no resolution to this, right? There's no resolution to the Fugitive Slave Act. There's no resolution to Kansas, Nebraska. The next crisis. Dred Scott decision. Again, more textbook stuff. Dred Scott decision is a case that had been floating around for a while, eventually makes its way to the Supreme Court. In 1856, this decision is released in 1857. The Dred Scott decision was a decision about the person Dred Scott. Scott was a slave, purchased, forget what year, but you know, McClay can help you out with the details on Dred Scott's background. Purchased by this military officer, I think in Missouri, slave state, as we've seen. Here's the thing with military officers, though, right? They're constantly moving around. They're constantly being asked to move from state to state. And so Dred Scott is rightfully, according to the laws of Missouri, he's rightfully owned by this military commander while he's in Missouri. But then this military commander is moved to Illinois and then to Minnesota. Illinois and Minnesota are both free states. Dred Scott's owner takes Dred Scott with him. Dred Scott is a slave in Illinois. But I thought Illinois was a free state. How can somebody own slaves in a free state? Estimates are that the time Dred Scott was in Illinois, I think in the 1830s or 1830s, there were about 70,000 enslaved African Americans in Illinois, in a free state. How can you have slave owning? How can you have slaves in a free state? This is the thing. Things happen at the state level that take a while to be worked out at the federal level. And so this was something that was happening. Slave owners moved into free states. They took their slaves with them. And it's not challenged. Until somebody presses the issue. Ultimately, Dred Scott will be given as this military commander eventually decides to marry a nice Louisiana planter gal, gives Dred Scott as a wedding gift. That's so weird. Guys, if you're thinking of good, if you're thinking of getting married soon, you think of giving a gift to your wife, like don't give another human being. It's a little weird, but that's what they did at this time. Eventually, Master dies. Dred Scott says, "Hey, lady, we should be free. Like we lived in 3 states. We should have been freed at that time." He's back in Missouri at this time. We should have been freed at that time. So let us go, or we're leaving. We're free. The widow refuses to release Dred Scott and his wife. So Dred sues her. And this kind of bumps back and forth between the courts, for the courts for a while before making its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides to take this up. Supreme Court does not hear very many decisions, but the Supreme Court decides they kind of need to hear this decision because it's a pretty big one, right? It's a slave suing an American citizen. Can that even happen? Over the issue of the free state, slave state divide. Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
The Supreme Court by the 1850s, I mean, they're looking at America and are saying, all right, obviously the people can't settle the slavery issue. They're at war with each other, the Fugitive Slave Act. Congress and the president can't settle the issue. They're beating the hell out of each other on the congressional floor. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, we're going to have to settle the issue. Chief Justice Taney, looks like Taney. Chief Justice Taney
Issues his opinion in 1857. He's going to settle this issue. There are 2 parts to the Dred Scott decision. The first is that Dred Scott never should have sued the widow in the first place because Dred Scott isn't a citizen. What Taney argued, you have a selection of it there, the first paragraph up there. What Taney argued is, look, when we go back and look at what did the founding period suggest about this question of whether slaves are citizens or not. And Taney went back and looked at things we've looked at before. Remember the 1790 Naturalization Act? It said only 3 white persons could become citizens of the United States. Taney looked at things like that. And his conclusion in 1857 is, slaves were never intended to be citizens of the United States. They have no rights. Thus, they have no rights to sue the U.S. court. Taney goes beyond that. He doesn't say slaves have no rights. It's just people of color in general. African descended people in general were never intended to be citizens of the United States. Right? There's literally hundreds of thousands of free persons of color in the United States at that time. Taney's ruling is they don't have any rights either. One of the phrases that comes out of Taney's decision, one of the famous phrases that comes out of Taney's decision, the black man has no right. The white man is bound to respect. Taney is not distinguishing slave versus free, person of color. Any person of color were never intended to be citizens of the United States. They don't have rights. We talked about the white man's republic before. The 1850s was the decade of the white man's republic. This is the decade in which Stephen Douglas, the head of the Democratic Party, said America was built by the white man for the benefit of the white man. This phrase, white man's republic, its heyday was the 1850s. And now you have the supreme law of the land, the Supreme Court coming along and saying, yeah, Douglas is right. Yeah, white supremacists are right. People of color, slave or free, they were never intended to be citizens of the United States. Don't shoot the messenger. When I say that America was white supremacist, it's what the leaders of the country were saying. Okay? We can certainly debate whether a term like white supremacy categorizes the United States today, or certainly after 1960, but do not allow US history to be whitewashed. Oh, you know, we were never racist. We were never white supremacists. That never fits. No, it was literally the head of the Democratic Party declaring us a white nation, the head of the Supreme Court. And yes, people of color, they have no rights. The Dred Scott decision was an incredibly consequential decision, declaring the legal status of people of color as not having any rights. Now, the case should have ended at that point. Because what the Supreme Court has already said is Dred Scott never should have been able to sue in the first place, and so let it go. Taney decides, though, again, looking at the mess the country is in, Taney decides we're going to settle this slavery issue once and for all. That's the second part of the second paragraph of quotation of that. What Taney is saying is, look, you can't stop somebody. I mean, a basic right of an American citizen is that they can take their property with them when they leave. What is a slave? A slave is property. You can't bar a person then from taking their slave wherever they want to move in the United States. Taney is kind of suggesting, imagine you're in Pennsylvania and you own a clock. You really like your clock. Well, you have to move to Michigan for a new job. Michigan is an anti-clock state. No clocks allowed in Michigan. But you're in Pennsylvania, you get this great clock. Are you going to take your clock with you when you move to Michigan? Of course you are. And can Michigan stop you from taking your clock that you legally bought when you're in Pennsylvania? It seems kind of silly that Michigan would be able to bar you from taking your clock with you. That's your clock. You own that. If a slave is property, which is how American law defines slavery. And a basic right of American citizens is that they can take their property wherever they want to. And so Taney, the basis of a simple legal tradition of English property rights, settles the slavery question. What's the implication of Taney's argument? People should be able to take their property with them wherever they move. What's the implication of that argument then, for the fight over slavery? For the fight between free and slave states, what is the implication of Taney's argument? There's no such thing as free states. There aren't. And it was exactly how Northerners, and particularly the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, exactly how they responded to the decision. They freaked out because the implication was clear. Slavery can now go everywhere. We wondered if it could go everywhere. Now the Supreme Court is saying, yes, slavery can go everywhere. There are no more free states. Forget about slavery in Kansas or slavery in Michigan. Now we're talking about slavery in Pennsylvania. Now we're talking about slavery in Maine. The immediate effect of the Dred Scott decision
it didn't have that great an impact, honestly, among the South. Southerners by 1857 were already kind of freaked out and worried that, you know, the North was never going to allow for the expansion of slavery altogether. So, I mean, they were a little bit emboldened. They were a little bit encouraged by this decision, but frankly, Southerners were pretty split. I mean, there were some who were like, finally, we can take slavery everywhere now. Whereas a lot of other Southerners were like, nah, the North never going to allow that. Some Southerners already decided that the only hope for the South was to expand slavery to the South. We would never be able to expand to the West. The immediate effect of the Dred Scott decision was really on Northerners, and particularly on the shift of Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats over to the Northern Republican, over to the Republican Party. There wasn't a Northern Republican. That's redundant. There was their own Republican Party only in the North. The Republicans lost the presidential election of 1856, but their numbers dramatically increased after the Dred Scott decision. You have Abraham Lincoln even out in debates with Stephen Douglas. Lincoln's even going so far as to, you know, engaging in some conspiracy theories, suggesting that Tawney is in the pockets of Southern slave owners. Southern slave owners are buying off the Supreme Court, buying off Justice Tawney in this way. These aren't the kind of things you're supposed to say. The Supreme Court is supposed to be above politics, above partisanship. Lincoln here is openly saying, no, I'm not too sure about this Tawney guy. I think he's, you know, I think Southerners might have bought this guy off. And other Republicans are out there saying, are we really going to let, you know, 150,000 slave owners take away the liberty of tens of millions of Americans? Are we going to really allow the slave power, their term, aristocratic oligarchy of these Southern slave owners, are we going to allow them to destroy the liberties of tens of millions of freemen, white freemen, throughout the North? The effect of the Dred Scott, and I talked about this in the last lecture, right? As long as our national party system, it can be two-party, it's fine. As long as it's a national system, right? As long as there's Northern Whigs, Southern Whigs, as long as there's Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, we're okay. After Dred Scott, I mean, the Northern Whig Party had been declining significantly during the 1850s before Dred Scott. But after Dred Scott, it's pretty much dead. It's taken over by the Republican Party, a purely sectional party. Southern Whigs, that party is pretty much dead. The Whig Party is dead. Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, they persist through these years. But it's the rise of the Republican Party out of the ashes of the Northern Whigs, it's the end of the Southern Whigs, that makes it nearly impossible to work through the differences in Washington. And so the effect of the Dred Scott decision was in many ways ironic, right? Tawney issued this decision in order to settle the sectional controversy, to settle the slavery question, but he actually made things much, much worse. He essentially, in issuing this decision, nailed the lid on the coffin of the Whig Party and ensured the Republican Party was in great shape for the election of 1860. Where's the resolution to the where's the resolution to the Dred Scott decision? How do Northerners and Southerners figure out? They don't figure it out, right? with the unleashing of a purely sectional party, the Republican Party, with the rapid advance in the numbers, the resources of the Republican Party, with the rapid rising in the star of Abraham Lincoln, there's not much hope for holding the country together. Southerners are increasingly discouraged. They're encouraged, obviously, by the Dred Scott decision, but the rapid advance of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln, who they called the Black Republicans, right? The rapid advance led many Southerners to worry. It doesn't seem like we can compromise anymore. It just doesn't seem like we can really work together anymore. So the Union limps on after 1857 until its next crisis in 1859. You know,
it's hard sometimes to, point fingers and say, like, can the Civil War be blamed on like one person? If it can, that person's name would be John Brown. Remember John Brown from the Potawatomi Massacre? The dude's still running around. The dude's free. His son's killed a bunch of people in Kansas, walking around back home, when he learns of the Dred Scott decision. And he's not too happy about it. Voices from God again. God's telling John Brown, time to take a fight for the South. So John Brown begins developing a new strategy for combating slavery. He calls it, I'm sorry, I don't have this on the board. It's all right if you don't remember. His plan is called the Subterranean Mountain Pass. Essentially what Brown says is, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get me and some of my friends. We're going down through Virginia. And we'll get some guns along the way. We're going to start going plantation to plantation to plantation. We're going to start freeing the slaves. And we're going to build an army of former slaves. We're going to Django. We're going to on-chain slavery, the Django way. If you've seen the movie Django Unchained, you know what I'm talking about. We're gonna Django this thing. John Brown is the original guerrilla warrior in American history, guerrilla warrior theorist, American history. That's how we're gonna work. He goes, because he's friends with people like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. He goes and tells them of his plans, like, hey, you guys want to come along too? And they're like, have fun, John. So John gets some of his friends and he starts on the subterranean mountain pass. He goes down to Virginia. He stops at Harper's Ferry. There's a federal armory, a weapons depot at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. It's not heavily guarded because who's going to mess with the federal armory? John Brown's going to mess with the federal armory. So John Brown and his little band of brothers takes over the armory. For a little bit, right? Yeah, you had to get the weapons first, and then after you get the weapons, then you're going to start going plantation. What's it going to work? I could continue to tell you the story how this works out, but let's turn it over one last time to our good friend, Mr. Betts. So it doesn't end well for John Brown. A federal army headed by Robert E. Lee does eventually catch up at Harper's Ferry, and Brown is executed. Issue settled, right? Potential slave uprising, but it's stalled, it's over, right? Oh, shoot. Yeah. But we got one more song. Not Mr. Best though. Actually, I'll play that. Yeah, I'll play that next. No. Yeah, we should really play it now. Remember how the South sent Preston Brooks all these canes, right? That's not really the reaction. They should have condemned his actions. John Brown, the North should have condemned his actions. What do? They write a song in his honor.